So tonight we want to talk about Greek copies and something called textual variants. And those that have been in our service on Sundays, I try to stay away from mentioning textual variants because they, especially in a large group setting when you can't take questions or explain things fully, or it just detracts too much from the passage. You may mention there's a textual variant, but you don't do a lot of explanation behind the scenes. So I want to kind of dive into that tonight so you kind of know what textual variants are all about, and also understand the great amount of Greek manuscript copies that we have for the Bible, for the New Testament, really so that your confidence grows in basically what you hold your hand is the Word of God. It's derived from the originals and that it's accurate to the originals. And so we want to just consider that this evening. One of the things that we've got to state at the outset is that no original manuscript, there's a technical name for original manuscripts. They're called the autographs. The actual pen and paper that was in the presence of the Apostle Paul. When he wrote these letters through verbal, basically dictating these letters to a secretary. Those do not exist today. There's no original manuscript that exists today. Everything that we have today are copies of copies of copies of copies of the original. And that's really how ancient manuscripts worked. There was, obviously there weren't printing presses, there weren't copy machines. And so that's how they did it. And so there was a trade of scribes, and copyists and those kind of things that would copy originals. And then there were people that weren't professional scribes that would also, make their own copies at times. And so we have copies of copies of copies. And the process of copying was kind of as follows. The original manuscript would arrive at a church or to its audience, like in the case of Luke to Theophilus. And then the original manuscript was copied. And then copies were made of the copies of the original manuscript. And then on and on and on as believers from different churches, they would travel different places. They would secure copies of other letters. They would make copies for themselves. They would take that back to where they came from. That others would make copies of the new letter they'd obtained. And this is kind of how the copies came about. And they would secure copies of other New Testament books that were recognized as authentic writings of the apostles or their endorsees. And so as copies of the Bible spread around the world, what you began to see is regional variants would develop because of easy access to a particular set of regional templates. And let me pull up this diagram. I don't know how well that's going to show up on your screen, but just as we kind of work through, from the top down, you'll see that all of those kind of, they almost look like torn. They look like a box there on the right. With kind of the bottom torn off or whatever. Those are, represent copies. The very top box up there, it says the only Son of God. That represents the original manuscript, which obviously would be without error. And then every level after that is a second layer of copies that, originated from the original. And so just kind of keeping it very, very simple. You see that next layer, it's labeled as second century documents. This is copies of the original. So, there are multiple copies made of the exact original. And let's say they're in the second generation that the phrase, the only Son of God, was completely copied correctly. And so then you move to the third century and this third generation of copies, and you see two copies made of the one copy, and then you see three copies made of the second copy, and somewhere along the line you see that box that's kind of circled in red, and somehow the word only dropped off of a copy. Maybe the scribe was reading the copy, and he had a room full of other scribes that were copying it down audibly, and somebody just had a brain fart, as we say, or just kind of something happened there where they weren't paying close attention. They left the word only off. Or maybe the scribe didn't read only. He skipped over it on a line on accident. And so now you've got a copy there that's missing the word only. And, that's okay because other copies had the word only. But then as you kind of work again down into the next generation, now you've got copies being made of the one copy that's got the variant reading where only is missing. Well, then those copies of that copy are going to contain that variant error. And so you can kind of follow that down into, the next generation of copies. And so what you're going to find is if basically, let me see if I can, I won't mess with it. But anyways, what you're going to find is that, you might get down into the 5th century copies. You might have one of the really clean copies that represents exactly the original. And then you might have 2 or 3 copies that have a variant in it. And you're trying to determine which one was the original. And this is what the science of textual criticism does. It takes the copies that you have and it kind of uses different steps, scientific steps that work its way back to the original. But this is kind of just a really crude way to explain how variants get introduced. And so what you see is as we look at the originals and the copies that there's some historical things that impacted this as well. The Middle East especially was impacted in terms of the number of copies available of the New Testament manuscripts, largely due to the Islamic conquest in the 7th century. Because of this, places like Egypt and Syria and Israel did not see a long history of Bible manuscripts. The Islamic conquest, they were destroying these documents. And so that's why you don't see, in terms of a lot of copies, prior to that area and after that era, is because of that. Also, in other areas of the Roman world, Latin became the dominant language in the Western Roman Empire in the 3rd century. And so, the making of Greek copies of the New Testament, it slowed in that area of the Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire continued to speak Greek all the way into the 15th century. And so you're going to see a large number of copies of the Greek New Testament in those areas of the Eastern Roman Empire. We'll kind of talk about that in more detail later because we've got a big family of copies that come from that area known as Byzantine. But the other thing that we see is during the first 3 centuries AD, Christianity was illegal. And so they were subject to persecution. Hence, not many complete manuscripts from this period can be found. So the Emperor Diocletian in 303 AD, he actually demanded that all sacred books would be burned. And so then again, that cost us a lot of Greek manuscripts in those areas that executed his edict. But again, that plays into the number of manuscripts we have, the number of copies we have, the numbers that we don't. Also, from the 4th century and 5th centuries, following the legalization of Christianity by Emperor Constantine, a multiplication of New Testament manuscripts appeared. What's developed over the years are some fairly recognizable families of copies, and they're called families because they originate from the same geographic area and they originate during the same time frame. I want to introduce you to 3 families of copies, and these are the 3 that are brought up most often and really impact the English translations that we have. The very first one is known as the Alexandrian family. These are copies of manuscripts from the 1st to the 9th century. In terms, they were copied during that time. Not that they were found during that time. They're found much later, actually. But they date back to this time period. Now, the one thing about this family of copies is many people don't know this, but there are roughly 10 of these manuscripts. So it's not that many. This family grouping has become known as the minority text. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but the New American Standard, the ESV, the NIV, if there's ever a variant between this family of copies and then the other families of copies, they tend to gravitate toward this family of copies as closer to the original because of the age. They were closer to the original. And so that's kind of the argumentation. We'll kind of work through that as we go through all of these copies. The Alexandrian family manuscripts tend to be older. and they're characterized by more abrupt and difficult readings. And you might be like, well, why does that matter? Well, from a textual critic perspective, the science of textual criticism, the fact that they're more abrupt and more difficult, they're rougher, if you will, means that they are most likely closer to the original, because scribes over the centuries had a tendency to try to smooth things out for easier readability. And so the argument is if they're rougher or more abrupt in readings, they're probably closer to the original. That's just kind of a tenet of textual criticism. Now, these manuscripts were discovered later. They weren't available when the King James, for instance, in 1611 was translated. They weren't available when Erasmus was putting together the Textus Receptus. These Alexandrian family of texts were not found until a much later period, even though they were written in an earlier period, right? 1st to the 9th centuries. So the most popular, and you may have heard of these or well known of these Alexandrian or minority manuscripts, are known as Codex Sinaiticus, which was discovered in 1844, dated to the 4th century AD, and then Codex Vaticanus, which was found in the 1400s, dated to the 4th century AD. Those are the full manuscripts that they found. Now, they've also found fragments from early dated. I think one of the neatest fragments that has been found from the Alexandrian family is been identified by textual critics as P52. That's just kind of what they name this fragment. And the fragment is as small as the palm of your hand. It's the piece of paper that it's on. And it contains John 18, 31 through 33 and 37 through 38. And what's really cool and interesting about P52 as a member of this family of copies is it was sent to the world's leading papyrologist, and he dated it between 100 and 150 AD. Others even believe that it should be dated in the 90s. Well, that is really neat stuff, because we believe the Apostle John wrote the book of John in the mid-90s. And so if this is a copy from the late 90s or a copy from early 100s, we're talking less than 10 years. And so obviously very close to the original. So just kind of exciting stuff. And what's really exciting about it is most of the copies, obviously we only have 10 of them, but most of the copies did not survive because of the material that they were printed on. So these earlier manuscripts from the Alexandrian family were somewhat identifiable due to the material, papyri, and then due to their text. They were typically written in uncials. That's the technical term, which is just capital Greek letters. So obviously many of these manuscripts from the 1st to 9th centuries were destroyed in the ways that I described earlier, the Islamic conquest, the fact that Christianity was illegal, the edict by Diocletian, and those kind of things. But also, writing on papyri just didn't last as long as other methods that they developed later on. But that's what makes this family of copies so unique. Again, as I mentioned, these manuscripts heavily influenced the newer translations, the NASB, the NIV, the ESV. If some of you have ever heard of the Net Bible also is heavily influenced by the Alexandrian family. So if there's a variant discrepancy between the minority text and what we're going to see, the other main family is the majority text, they typically lean toward the variant in the minority text. And that's an oversimplification of what they do, but that's generally the way that you do it. In fact, if you've ever had a note, a footnote in your Bible that says something like the NU says this, or better translations say this, what they're saying is that's the minority text. So a lot of times in the New King James, they'll have a note that says NU, the letters N and U. Text reads, and they'll give a different word. They'll give a variant. And then the NU is the minority text. They're talking about this family, the Alexandrian family. So some of the things that's interesting about the Alexandrian family, these 10 manuscript copies that they have that are earlier, is they have some omitted readings, okay, in the manuscripts. By the way, I should have started the lesson by saying definitely have your Bible tonight. If I don't know what version you use, but maybe try to grab a New King James or a King James version. And then if you've got access to an NIV, an ESV, or an NASB, you'll be able to see some of the differences. And so I'll definitely grab those. If you've got multiple translations, you might just find this interesting tonight. But with the Alexandrian family of copies, the Gospel of Mark finishes at Mark 16:8 and does not contain verses 9 through 20. And so if you've got a Bible, go to Mark chapter 16. What you're going to see is typically, by the way, I believe all Bible versions include Mark 16:9 through 20. But what you're going to find is you're going to see a note in most of our Bibles. And let me just read. I've got a kind of a pocket New King James version here. And even in this version, it says verses 9 through 20 are bracketed in NU text as not original. They are lacking in Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, although nearly all other manuscripts of Mark contain them. You'll just kind of have a note, and that's what it's talking about there. But again, you see that Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus do not include Mark 16:9 through 20. And so you'll typically have a note about that. This might surprise you, but John 7:53 to John 8:11, which is the story of the woman caught in adultery, is also not included in the Alexandrian family. It's not included in what we would call, again, the minority text, the NU. And so go to John chapter 7 and just kind of see, you can see if your version includes this. This version that I've got basically says that 7:53 through 8:11 are bracketed by the NU text. Again, that's the minority text, the Alexandrian that we're talking about, is not original, but they are present in over 900 manuscripts. Well, not 900 manuscripts in the Alexandrian family, but that would have to be in the majority text. So you'll see some variants show up, and that's what we're talking about there. And so again, just shows a little bit of a difference between the different families, where some regional variants can develop in some of these areas. And so again, what are the arguments for the minority text, the NU, the Alexandrian text? Well, the argument for these to be the dominant manuscripts used is their age and the fact that they have harder, more abrupt readings. Again, they would view that as being closer to the original autographs. Okay. Now there's a second family I'll mention. This family doesn't get as much interest by scholars, and that is the Western family of copies. Those date to about the 3rd to the 9th centuries. Again, the reason there's not a super strong argument for these on a scholarly level is they tended to paraphrase the text, the copies did. And so there's only one Greek unsealed, again, that means capital letter, manuscript that exists for the 4 Gospels and Acts. And that's from the 5th century. That's called Codex Bezae or Bezae. And by the way, this is the primary text type behind the Latin Vulgate done by Jerome in AD 382. And it's probably the reason for that. I don't think Jerome felt like this was superior per se. I just think this is what he had access to. He had access to the Western family of copies, and so he utilized that for his Latin Vulgate translation. Now, the argument for these manuscripts to be the dominant manuscripts is their acceptance and validation by the Catholic Church. Remember, the Latin Vulgate became the Bible of the Church, for almost 1,100 years, and obviously very much the Catholic Church gravitated toward that version, and even with some of the later Catholic, what's the word? I can't think of the word, but anyways, the Catholic meetings where they decided that they would continue the Mass in Latin. They're still using the Latin Vulgate. So there's some interest in validating these family of copies. But on a scholarly level, typically most scholars work with the two families, the Alexandrian text, the minority text, and then the next one that we're about to look at, which is known as the Byzantine text or the majority text. And this is what I had mentioned earlier, that there were parts of the Roman Empire that continued to speak Greek. And this was the Eastern Roman Empire, the known as the Byzantine area. And so we've got copies from this family from the 5th to the 15th centuries. And so the reason that this is one of the major families that people go back to is they are the most available and the most numerous. And thus, this text family is known as the majority text. They've got the majority of the copies. They've got the majority of the different fragments. And so the earliest printed editions of the Greek New Testament were basically derived from Byzantine texts and readings. Now, one of the things that we know about Byzantine, this family, is none of this text type was found on papyri, indicating that this text type was not copied before the 5th century. We know from history that towards the 8th and 9th centuries, the use of papyrus for manuscripts began to decline. Instead, documents and books were written on parchment, vellum, which again is like a skin from an animal. They soaked it, they dried it, they scraped it, they rubbed it until it was thin and smooth, and then they would write on it, and thus it would last more, or it would last longer than any of the papyri. And so this gives us a great hint, not only geographically where these copies were found, but also what they're written on. The Textus Receptus, you probably heard that phrase if you've been around, any kind of discussion of Greek manuscripts. But the Textus Receptus, or the TR, some people abbreviate it, which was put together by Erasmus, and the Greek text used as the basis for the 1611 King James Version. So Erasmus put the TR together, and then the TR was kind of the main text, if you will, that was used as a basis for the 1611 King James Version. This is all based on 6 manuscripts from the Byzantine tradition. And so this was the dominant textual family until scholars began to find older manuscripts, the uncial, the capital letter manuscripts on papyri in the Alexandrian family. And so, from about the 1500s until the 1800s, which is when they discovered some of these Alexandrian texts, this was the dominant family. This is what people used for especially the English translations I'm speaking of. And so the argument for these manuscripts to be the dominant manuscripts is the sheer number of copies and scholars that they possess. We've got over 5,300 copies of this family of manuscripts and 24,000 fragments. Now, when you compare that to Alexandrian, you can see why some people would gravitate and say, well, that's the majority of the copies we have are in this one family, and so I'm going to just trust that this is probably more accurate because of just the sheer number of copies that we have to compare. And so you can see why there's an argument. Do you go with the sheer numbers of copies, or do you go with the oldest manuscripts that are closest to the originals? And you can see why there would be an argument back and forth. And so just to kind of set the stage for that, we'll kind of keep talking about that as we go. But let's just define textual criticism. I've used that term a couple of times, but let's go ahead and define it. We'll also define textual variants. And I want to look closely at textual variants tonight and give some examples as to how you work through them, how you sort through them, that kind of thing. So textual criticism, when you define it, is simply the process of attempting to ascertain the original wording of a text from copies of the original. And by the way, textual criticism is not just a biblical science of study. It's used for any ancient manuscript. So there's a methodology to textual criticism. It's not just people making things up and wanting to accept things as original wording. There's a process that they work through. And I think you'll be surprised by this next point. You may or may not know this, but did you know that we actually do not have the original document of the Gettysburg Address given by President Abraham Lincoln? In fact, what they did is they accurately created the original using 6 different documents with variants. You had people try to record what Abraham Lincoln had said. Abraham Lincoln's notes for the address were not available. It wasn't like he had the whole speech printed up. Some of that was extemporaneous. And so people tried to record what he said. And so they ended up with 6 different documents taken down by different people. And they were able to put that together. And through the science of textual criticism, even though there were variants, they were able to put together what the original wording was most likely, down to a pretty high level of accuracy. And that was, textual criticism was used to do that. Also, did you know that very few, if any, ancient documents from the time of the 1st century AD have survived, biblical or otherwise? And then the ones that have typically been scraps of paper, not entire documents. Again, part of the reason for that is the fact that they were written on papyri. Papyri just didn't last as long as the vellum and other material that they used later on. And so just to give you some examples of other ancient works, Homer and his Iliad, written about 800 BC, we only have 643 copies of the Iliad. And based on those copies, they're able, through textual criticism, to put together the document and be pretty confident that they've got it 95% accurate. But there's variants found in there. And variants could be, even in a copy, just something as simple, and we'll look more detail as a misspelling. And we'll talk more about variants here in a second. But just some other examples. Herodotus, his history, written 480 to 425 BC, there's only 8 copies that exist. And yet you could go, check that out in a scholarly library. But they're basing on 8 copies. What's the percentage of accuracy? They really don't know because they don't have enough copies to really determine that. I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name, but history, again, 8 copies, low level of accuracy. Plato, in terms of some of his writings, 7 copies is all we have. Tacitus, his Annals, you've got 20 copies. That's from AD 100. Again, what kind of accuracy do you have from 20 copies? It's hard to say. Pliny Secundus wrote Natural History. Again, there's only 7 copies that exist. Again, the accuracy is really hard to guess. Now, to put that in perspective with the New Testament, remember, we've got over 5,300 manuscript copies of New Testament books and over 24,000 fragments. And as one New Testament textual critic said, that New Testament textual criticism suffers from an embarrassment of riches unparalleled by any other piece of ancient literature. And so just, to put it in perspective, we have more and earlier manuscript evidence about the person of Jesus Christ than we do anyone in the ancient world. More than Julius Caesar, more than Alexander the Great, anyone. And so it gives us this, hopefully it undergirds your faith to know that what we've got in the Bible is just incredibly accurate based on the copies and the ability to kind of work our way back to what the original text actually said. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not variants. And I want to define textual variants, especially as it relates to the copies in the Bible. Now, these variants arise when a copyist makes either deliberate or inadvertent alterations to the text that is being reproduced. Okay, so let's be honest. There are copyists that will make deliberate changes to maybe better suit how they feel about it. Maybe they're trying to change it so it's not as offensive to the audience that they're copying it for. But then there were inadvertent alterations. We'll kind of talk about these in more detail, but let me just, on a really basic level, say this, that most scholars put the number of variants for the New Testament at around 400,000 variants. Now, it's a staggering number when you put that together with the fact that there are only about 138,000 words in the Greek New Testament. So that means there on average, there's almost 3 variants per word. Now, that's a statistic that if someone breaks out, you know, your mind's blown. You know, your faith, is shattered in a sense. You feel like it would be, because that just seems like, how could you ever tell what the original was with that many variants? But let's talk about that on a basic level, and we'll get in kind of more detail. Variants are often described in 2 ways. The first way is, are they meaningful? Okay, and so what does that mean? Well, this is when a variant creates a nonsensical text, meaning that it's not grammatically correct or it cannot be understood. Okay, and many of the variants that we have are just not meaningful. Okay, and so let me give you an example of an unmeaningful variant, if you will, one that's not meaningful. We know that Jesus instructed believers to love your neighbor as yourself. But if a scribe accidentally replaced the N with an M, the text would say, love your neighbor as yourself. That would not be a meaningful variant. It's an obvious error, right? This would create a nonsensical text. There's no word that means neighbor, right? There's no word that exists, neighbor. Now, neighbor is one. So if you had, 5,300 copies and 4 or 5 of them had neighbor and the rest of them had neighbor, well, clearly it's not a meaningful variant. It created something nonsensical. A second type of variant it's what's called viable. This is when a variant creates a difference that could be true. And you're trying to figure out, okay, is this variant, is this the true reading or is this the true reading? Because either one of these variants could be true. Okay. And let me just give you an example in English. Dan Wallace, who we're gonna watch a quick video by him here in a second. In fact, I'm gonna go back here after I read this quote, because I think I need to check the volume so you guys can hear it. But anyways, Dan Wallace is one of the leading Greek scholars in the world right now. He's a professor at Dallas Seminary. He may be retired now, but he still works in this area of textual criticism, and he does a great job of providing resources that are understandable. His Greek textbook is still the textbook in seminaries when somebody is learning Greek. He wrote a book called Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics, and it's the textbook for Greek in seminaries all over the world. But Dan Wallace gives this as an example, as a viable variant. He says, what if someone copied the U.S. preamble to the Constitution and accidentally wrote onion instead of union? In other words, someone accidentally closed the top of the U to make an O, which by the way is a potentially easy mistake to make in copying if someone's copying it by hand. So it would read, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect onion. And so Wallace says, is that a meaningful sentence? Well, yes, it is. Grammatically correct, and it can be understood. Is it viable? And really the answer is it might be. It might be if the majority of the population of the United States were geneticists trying to engineer the perfect onion that was easy to grow and tasted delicious, but that's not the reality. So most copies of the preamble of the Constitution have the word union, and so it's easy to demonstrate that onion is not a viable variant in this context, even though it could make sense, but clearly that is not why the United States was founded, to make the perfect onion, right? We know that from history. Let me play a quick video. This is Daniel Wallace actually in a debate. He's debating a guy by the name of Bart Ehrman, Bart Ehrman's a professor at the University of North Carolina that really tries to destroy the validity of the Bible. And so he's in a debate. But what he's going to do here in this small clip is he's going to describe the variants that exist in the New Testament copies. Okay, so what we see there is the one of the main critics of the validity of the Bible himself admits that none of the textual variants of the 400,000 that we have do any kind of damage to any of the essential Christian Orthodox beliefs. And you would think if one guy wanted to claim that it completely destroyed orthodoxy, that would have been the guy. But he clearly admitted on a scholarly level that that was not the case. There are four main kinds of textual problems or variants in biblical textual criticism. And I want to consider these because I think these will be very helpful for you to understand. Because again, someone just puts out that statistic that, oh, there's only 138,000 words in the Greek New Testament and there's 400,000 textual variants. That's almost 3 per word. That is just, you can't trust it. And people will throw that stat out there sometimes, the ones that know it. But let's look at the 4 types of textual variants just to kind of make you feel a little bit better about the Bible that you hold in your hand. The largest number of textual variants, well over half, some say as high as 70%, involve spelling differences and nonsense readings that are easily detectable. And so these affect nothing of meaning in the text. This was something that I learned when I started doing this study that I didn't even know, but did you know that spelling in general was not systematized until much later in human history? And even in English, spelling was not systematized until roughly 1555 with Samuel Johnson's publication entitled The Dictionary of the English Language. And so just something to consider, as these scribes are writing, there was, a general understanding of spelling, but there were occasional spelling errors in the copying of the original text. And even in John, in the book of John, what we're going to see is that John himself used 3 different spellings of the same word in John 19, 9:14, 9:17, and 9:21. Let's go to John 9 so we can I want you to see it in English, and then I'll come back and we'll look at the rest of that note there in the PowerPoint. But John 9:14, 17, and 21. And we're looking at the word opened. Okay, that's the English word. The Greek verb in its base form is anoigo. So verse 14, now it was the Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Verse 17, they said to the blind man again, what do you say about him because he opened your eyes? Verse 21, and by what means he now sees we do not know, or who opened his eyes we do not know. He is of age, ask him, he will speak for himself. And what we find, and I put this in your notes so you can kind of look at it, but in verse 14, anoigo is spelled anoiakin, okay, aneokin, and I put the parsing in there for you to see all of these words are the same exact parsing. Okay, so it's not a different form. What that means is they're all aorist, active, indicative, third person, singular. Verse 17, instead of being spelled the way it was in verse 14, it's spelled anoike, okay, and you see again it's aorist, active, indicative, third person, singular. And then in verse 21, it's spelled anoiakin, okay, anoikin. And notice the difference between the second use there and the third use. It just dropped what we would say is a letter N, right? Everything else is the same. And this is actually the most common spelling error for these types of textual variants. It's what's called a movable nu. And that's an N. Okay, like we would see that, in a transliterated Greek word as an N, that last N on the back of those words. And it's at the end of one word before another word that starts with a vowel. So we've got something similar in English, a similar principle with the indefinite article a book versus an apple. And so that's the most common spelling error amongst the textual variants of spelling errors, is this movable nu. Again, these types of variants can be easily understood as to how they developed. because when certain scribes had someone dictate the text verbally to them as they wrote, they might drop the movable nu, they might add it, they might spell it differently, add a different letter on accident, etc. Because again, spelling had not been systematized. And so in our day, I mean, think about it. If somebody was dictating something for you to copy, you might miswrite here for here, or air for air, or two and two. You know, you'll see that a lot of time on text messages, right? If you pay close attention to grammar, you'll see people will misuse one of these words. So they'll do that in emails. They meant to, like TOO, and they put TO. Or they put, here, like I'm here, and they actually put the word like that you hear with your ear. And so these are the kind of spelling variants that you see showing up in some of the New Testament copies. And this is kind of the main variant type, over 70%, some people put it at. Now, the next largest group of variants are those that do not affect translation, or if they do, they involve synonyms. Like, here's an example. Christ Jesus or Jesus Christ. You see a little bit of a slightly different emphasis, but nothing of great consequence is involved. In fact, if you look at, let's go to Ephesians 1. Ephesians 1:1. I think the New King James says, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, by the will of God. And I think the ESV says, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus. So we see that variant switch in order there. But again, no consequence is there as a result of that. John 4:1. I kind of got the example. Again, the Byzantine or majority manuscripts, which is the basis for the King James and New King James, have in John 4:1, therefore when the Lord knew. When you look at the Alexandrian manuscripts, the minority texts, the 10 copies they have that are early, which are the basis for the ESV, the NASB, and the NIV, they have, in contrast, now when Jesus learned. And so one has Jesus here, the other one has Lord. Okay, this is a variant, but again, nothing is at stake theologically. You kind of just see that as an example. So that's the next largest group of variants. We've got the spelling errors, and then we've got what we would call synonyms, Lord and Jesus. Well, we think, we know that's the same person. So it doesn't really change anything in terms of meaning or theological significance. Then there are something that we would call meaningful variants that are not viable. Okay, that is, they simply have no plausibility of reflecting the wording of the original because the manuscripts in which they are found have a poor pedigree. And so this issue obviously involves careful historical investigation. Variants that are not viable, again, may only be found in one copy and thus have no claim. These are what we would call anomalies. These are variants that are they're just an anomaly. One copy may appear in the 12th century that's totally unique and one of a kind. And so obviously on the basis of the plethora of other copies and other argumentation from different textual families, this would be viewed as a non-viable variant. Somehow it slipped into a copy. They don't know why. There's no rhyme or reason for it, but it's got no other support anywhere else. And so there's a couple of those types of variants in the Greek copies that we have. And then finally, the smallest category, which comprises about 1% of all textual problems in the New Testament. So again, it takes that number 400,000 and it knocks it down to a much smaller number. It includes variants that are both meaningful and viable. In other words, they're sensical and they could be viable. But again, most New Testament scholars would say that these textual problems constitute much less than 1% of the total. But even if you assume the more generous amount, by expanding the scope of both meaningful and viable, even then, not much is theologically is affected. Wallace, who I mentioned earlier, Dr. Dan Wallace, he actually puts the amount in this variant category as 1/10 of 1%. That's his assessment of these types of variants that are both meaningful and viable. Let me give you a few examples so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. 1 John 1:4. in the Byzantine family, you've got your joy. In the Alexandrian family, you've got our joy. Okay? So, and I wanted you to see this in the Greek. I've transliterated it so you can see it really clearly. But notice that the word your in the Greek is the word humon, whereas our in the Greek is the word hemon. Okay, so you can kind of see why that might be a potential copyist error there, and that might be a variant. But in terms of changing something theologically, let's go to 1 John and read it either way. Both readings would be technically correct. So you could go either way with that. But 1 John 1:4 says, "These things we write to you that your joy may be full." Now, do you think John is writing these things to leaders so that they would have full, maximum joy in their life? I think so. But do you think John is also writing these things to them because if they receive them, that would also provide him with maximum joy and the people that were with him? Yes. So I think both could be true. It doesn't affect anything theologically there. Go to Matthew chapter 18. Matthew 18:15. Very famous passage. It says, "Moreover, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he hears you, you have gained your brother." And what we see is the words "against you" are in doubt from certain families of copies. So go back to verse 15. "Moreover, if your brother sins against you," or it could read, "Moreover, if your brother sins." So the other verses in this passage also seem to confirm that it should be "if your brother sins." And so regardless of whether or not the sin is against you, the concept is you should still correct or confront them. You know, the argument would be like, well, yeah, as long as he doesn't sin against you, don't worry about it. Don't say anything. But even in a situation where a brother sins, we as believers still have a responsibility in some scenarios to confront them or to correct them or to point that out as a potential blind spot. But those words aren't there in the Alexandrian text. Okay, so in the minority text, the words "against you" don't have it. But what's really interesting about this textual variant is if you went to the ESV and the NIV, they will still include "against you," even though the minority text does not contain those words. The NASB is the only major translation that drops these words. The Byzantine text, the New King James, the King James versions have the words "against you." But again, it doesn't necessarily destroy anything theologically there if "against you" is not there or it is. Okay, there may be a difference in emphasis, but again, it doesn't destroy anything theologically. Interestingly enough, Romans 5:1. Let's go to Romans 5:1 and read that, and then we'll kind of read this note as well. But Romans 5:1 says, "Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ." Again, we have. It looks like it's something that we possess, where the NU or the minority text reading would have "let us have." Again, what's the reason for the variant? Well, most likely this was copied wrong, either visually or audibly. Again, notice the difference in the Greek word. I've got the transliteration there for you in blue, but you've got ekomen and you've got ekamen. The only difference there is, if you can see it in the Greek lettering there, is the very first has the subjunctive. It's the letter omega. The second word, ekamen, you'll notice it's not the omega, the O sound, it's the A sound, which is Omicron, which obviously is being made popular now with COVID, but that's the Omicron. So that's the difference. And you can see why there's a potential variant there. You know, if someone is just reading it visually and they accidentally write an Omicron instead of an omega, or they hear it audibly and someone doesn't pronounce it completely correctly, or they mishear the pronunciation, they substitute an Omicron for omega, then you're going to have a variant. And by the way, Daniel Wallace shares in his book that this is still debated in the Dallas Seminary Greek department as to what it should be. Should it be we have or let us have? Wallace kind of draws a line. He's pretty confident that it's we have, as he studied the text and the variants and what is probably the original reading. He's pretty confident it's we have. And so obviously that's what most versions take, the majority text especially takes in that way. Another couple of examples. 1 Timothy 3:16. God was manifested in the flesh. That's what you have in the Byzantine, the majority text family, King James, New King James. But in the Alexandrian family, the minority text family, it doesn't say God was manifested in the flesh. It says he or who was manifested in the flesh. Well, when you understand the way copyists wrote, the Greek words may have been unintentionally confused. Has, or it looks like os, but there's an H in the Greek, has, versus theos. Because theos sometimes was reduced to has with a bar above and a bar in the middle as a sacred name. It was a way to abbreviate God. Theos means God. And so has was a way to abbreviate it with a line above and a line in the middle. And so obviously if someone didn't write a very dark line, you can see why somebody might have thought it was just has, meaning who. And so again, you've got these variants that show up. Again, these are meaningful, they're viable, but again, does it change any theological meaning here? God or he, it's referring to God. So we know it's God, even though it's saying he. Ephesians 3:9, I may have addressed this really briefly because I didn't want to, again, confuse the flow of the text, but Ephesians 3:9 in the Byzantine family, the majority text, it has fellowship of the mystery, whereas the Alexandrian text has a variant that reads administration of the mystery. And you can see why there might be confusion. Fellowship in the Greek is the word koinonia, whereas administration is the Greek word oikonomia. And so you can see how that might have been either misheard verbally by a scribe, where a variant could have shown up, or again, somebody reading quickly and just, writing it down without thinking it. You can see how that variant might be introduced. But again, it doesn't do any harm to the theological meaning going with either of those wording. And so I wanted to give you kind of some examples of what is called, meaningful and viable variants. Again, just to show you that it doesn't impact anything of necessary understanding theologically for what we believe to be orthodox teaching. And then finally, I just wanted to share this with you. I just thought this was interesting. Daniel Wallace, again, the gentleman I've mentioned a couple of times, he actually created an exercise for small groups. He used to travel around and do this for churches all over the country. And he did this exercise called the Gospel According to Snoopy, like Snoopy from Charlie Brown. And in this exercise, he would take 20 to 25 people and he would make them scribes. And then he would take another 20 to 25 people and he'd make them textual critics. And he would use this as an example of how textual criticism works and how you can be confident that even with copies that have variants, how you can use these principles to work back to the reading of the original. So he had an original version of the Gospel According to Snoopy. And then what he does, his stated goal in this illustrative workshop was to introduce as many corruptions into the text that he could in 1 hour of copying. And so by doing so, he says that this would be way more corrupt than any of the New Testament manuscript families that we have. And so he purposely introduces more corruptions to the text in 1 hour than what has happened over 1,500 years of Bible copying in transmission. And so to kind of give you some examples of what he does more than this. But in Schroeder 1, he's got all these labels for these corrupted texts. And so in Schroeder 1, one of the copyists was to copy their manuscript that they had and make a copy for personal use. So the instruction was they are not to print, but to write in cursive. and they are to copy one word at a time without proofreading. Okay, so these are the instructions for Schroeder 1. For Lucy 1, the copyist is to copy by sight, but they were to attempt to soften the chauvinistic language of the original of the gospel according to Snoopy. So they don't change the text drastically, but they change it subtly so that the chauvinism was toned down. Now, I don't have an original copy of the gospel according to Snoopy, but I think the original document had some intentionally chauvinistic language. And so Lucy 1, whoever was the copyist identified as Lucy 1, their role was to kind of tone that down a little bit, that language. Now, Lucy 2A, which happens after Lucy 2B, they would copy Lucy 1. They would copy that manuscript by sound, meaning someone would read the text to them, and then they would copy it that way. And so you can see, just kind of introduces lots of different copies and lots of different instructions for these copies. In Schroeder 2, they were to make a few cultural changes or updates because they're going to be sharing the story with a tribal culture they're meeting with. So maybe in Schroeder 1, a copy from the original would say something about driving a car. And because Schroeder 2 is taking his copy to a tribal culture, he might replace, driving a car with, riding a horse or something. And so he would kind of culturally change it to make it more applicable to the culture that he's reading to. And so what he's done is he's intentionally made copies that introduced corruptions to the original manuscript. And you know that he has done this exercise at the last time that I checked with over 70 different groups, 70 different church groups. And when they finish the project, they compare each of the manuscripts. They utilize textual criticism strategies and principles and techniques. And the worst that they've ever done is produced a manuscript that was only 2 words off from the original. In fact, many times they had the exact wording, even with all of the intentional corruptions. I think that's pretty miraculous, honestly. And it just shows you where textual criticism has developed as a science to give us great confidence that although we don't have the originals, when we have this plethora of copies and we can compare and we can evaluate, we can get back to basically word for word of what the original contained, even though oftentimes thousands of years or hundreds of years separate the copy from the original. So I just kind of wanted to share that with you too. I thought that was kind of a really cool, exercise there that Wallace does. So that's really the end of our study tonight. And let me close this with a word of prayer. Lord, I do thank you for the opportunity to study tonight. I realize this is so much information. We're covering so much history. We're covering some technical type topics, but thank you, Lord, as we get to the end of it, as we can summarize it in our thinking. It's just so encouraging, as Carl mentioned, to know that you have the capability to preserve your word, that you use human instruments, faulty human instruments at that, to do it, and that we can be confident that what we hold in our hand is accurate. It's just amazing to see that and all of the obstacles that these copies and these copyists faced throughout history. And so we're just so grateful, Lord, that we can understand what you desire to communicate with us. We pray as we go about our week that we'd be occupied with you, that we would just enjoy you more and more each day, just on a relational intimacy level. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.